On the morning of October 11, 1854, the auction rooms on Chalmers Street in Charleston witnessed an event that would echo through parlors, counting houses, and private correspondence for generations. A woman was brought onto the platform, her wrists bound not with iron shackles, but with silken cord. And when the auctioneer finally brought his gavel down, the price shouted across the room stunned even the most seasoned traders. More than $42,000. In modern terms, that amounts to roughly $1.3 million paid for a single person. For comparison, the most expensive plantation sale that same year, an entire estate known as Menorah House, with 200 acres of prime cotton land and 37 enslaved laborers, sold for $38,000. No surviving record explains why 17 men bid against one another with such escalating desperation. No newspaper dared to print a proper account of what happened within those walls. And no official document reveals the identity of the man who ultimately claimed ownership, though 3 witnesses later stated he left Charleston the very same afternoon, traveling north with his purchase and never returned to South Carolina. The archives of the Charleston Mercury contain only a tiny reference to what transpired, hidden on page 9 between shipping notices and quack medicine advertisements. Just 7 words: unusual proceedings at Rowan's establishment. Nothing further. 1 week later, the paper's editor resigned without explanation and abruptly left the state. A week after that, Rowan's auction house was shuttered for good, its records sealed by court order, and its building quickly sold to a shipping merchant who converted it into a warehouse within the month. What made this woman worth more than an entire working plantation? What hidden knowledge or power drove Charleston's wealthiest men into a frenzy bordering on madness? What secret forced a buyer to carry his payment as physical gold because the banks refused to process the transaction through normal channels? Before we continue with the story Charleston tried so fiercely to erase, we want you to be a part of uncovering these forgotten truths. Subscribe to the Seal Room and turn on notifications, because stories deliberately buried by history must be brought back to light. Leave a comment and tell us what you think this woman possessed, what she knew that could possibly be worth more than gold. We want to hear your theories. Now, let us return to that October morning when something impossible happened on Chalmers Street. Charleston in 1854 held a peculiar place within the American South. The city liked to think of itself as the crown jewel of Southern refinement. Its cobblestone avenues were bordered by elegant townhouses painted in soft pastels. Its harbor pulsed with ships carrying cotton to Liverpool and rice to Boston. The Battery Promenade stretched along the waterfront, where wealthy families strolled beneath palmetto trees that whispered in the sea breeze. Church steeples rose sharply across the cityscape, their bells marking the passing hours in a place that moved with slow confidence, secure in its prosperity and convinced of its permanence. More than 40,000 people lived in Charleston then, nearly half enslaved and half free, though every lever of power rested in the hands of roughly 300 families who controlled the plantations, banks, shipping firms, and every commercial artery that produced wealth. These families knew each other intimately, their fortunes intertwined through marriages, business alliances, and obligations stretching back generations. The Ravenels, the Princetons, the Haywoods, the Middleton clans, names that appear on property deeds, bank charters, and the boards of every institution that mattered. They dined together at the Charleston Club, worshipped at St. Michael's or St. Philip's, and closed deals in offices along Broad Street, where transactions worth fortunes were sealed with handshakes between men who had known one another since boyhood. But beneath this refined exterior, Charleston harbored shadows. Every great fortune rests on foundations that prefer darkness, and in a city built on human bondage, those foundations held countless buried crimes, convenient disappearances, and ledger books describing transactions no one wished examined too closely. Rowan's auction house stood in a 3-story structure on Chalmers Street, only 2 blocks from the public market, where enslaved people were sold like livestock every Tuesday and Friday. Rowan catered to a wealthier clientele than the open market, offering privacy, discretion, and guarantees of quality that drew plantation owners from as far as Georgia and coastal North Carolina. Marcus Rowan, the proprietor, had run auctions for 23 years and had built an unusual reputation for reliability in a business where honesty was optional. He kept meticulous records, verified all papers, and maintained strong relationships with the banks that funded his transactions. His word carried weight among men who trusted almost no one. The morning of October 11th began unremarkably. The first listings came from an estate being settled after its owner's death. A cook, 2 maids, a coachman, and a gardener. They sold at predictable prices to predictable buyers. Rowan moved briskly through business, his voice clear in the warm October air. Around 60 men sat in ladder-back chairs, fanning themselves as the humidity still clung to the city despite autumn's approach. Then, at precisely 10:30, according to the pocket watch of a cotton broker named Bernard Whitford, who later offered sworn testimony, the atmosphere shifted. A rear door opened, and 2 men entered, escorting a woman whose presence instantly froze the room. She stood perhaps 5'6", unusually tall for the time, with posture straight enough to suggest military training. Her skin held the rich, deep brown tone of West African lineage, unmarked by the scars common on enslaved bodies subjected to hard labor or punishment. She wore a well-made dress of dark blue cotton with small bodice buttons, clothing far finer than what most enslaved women were ever allowed. Her hair was styled in a carefully woven crown of braids that must have taken hours, implying she had access to help in time impossible for ordinary plantation workers. But it was her expression that silenced the buyers. She scanned the room with a gaze that held no fear, no humiliation, no surrender. Instead, her eyes moved slowly from face to face, pausing just long enough to get the unsettling impression that she was cataloging each man, committing every detail to memory. Several attendees later admitted, though never publicly, that under her scrutiny they felt exposed, as if she were the one judging them, not the other way around. The 2 escorts at her sides wore clothes that marked them unmistakably as long-distance travelers. Dusty boots, coats rubbed thin at the seams, the weary posture of men who had ridden hard for days. More telling still, each carried a pistol openly at his belt, an anomaly in an auction house where weapons were ordinarily forbidden. Marcus Rowan descended from his platform, his composure shaken despite more than 2 decades of experience. He approached the 2 escorts, speaking with them in low, tense tones that those nearest the front struggled to decipher. One of the men withdrew a worn leather folio and handed Rowan several documents. As Rowan read, his expression shifted. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally something uncomfortably close to fear. He looked from the papers to the woman, then back again, as if silently trying to reconcile what he saw in front of him with what the documents claimed. For an instant, the woman met his gaze with a level, unwavering calm. And just for a heartbeat, the corners of her mouth curved upward in the faintest suggestion of a smile, so fleeting that witnesses later disagreed about whether it had truly happened or whether stress had made them imagine it. Rowan returned to the platform, gripping the papers tightly. He cleared his throat twice before speaking, and when he finally did, his voice held an uncertainty that the regular buyers in his audience had never heard before. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are presented today with an exceptional lot. The seller, who, under the statutes of South Carolina, is entitled to complete anonymity, has consigned a woman of approximately 30 years of age. No name is provided on the bill of sale. She will therefore be listed as Lot 47. Her origin is marked as Charleston, though no prior owner is identified. She bears no documented history of field labor or household service." A voice called out from the middle rows, sharp with irritation. "Then what's her value, Rowan? Why bring her here at all?" Rowan's jaw tightened. His knuckles blanched white around the edges of the papers. When he spoke again, his voice dropped low enough that those in the back had to lean in to hear it. "The seller has set an opening bid of $10,000. The silence that followed was total. Fans stopped mid-sweep. A clerk's halted in the middle of a word. Even the noise drifting in from the street, the creak of carts, the calls of vendors, seemed to fall away. $10,000 exceeded the annual income of many men present. It was enough to purchase a prosperous plantation, a townhouse in Charleston's most coveted district, or even a vessel capable of crossing the Atlantic. To demand such a sum for a single woman with no recorded skills or service was beyond outrageous. It was lunacy. "Have you gone mad, Rowan?" someone shouted. Other voices rose in agreement, a jumble of anger and disbelief. But Rowan did not budge. Instead, he did something none of the regulars had ever seen him do in 23 years of auctioneering. He began reading directly from the seller's notarized documents, his voice growing quieter with each line until the furious crowd had no choice but to fall silent to hear him. The seller provides the following sworn declaration, Rowan read, notarized before magistrate on the 6th of October this year. The individual identified as Lot 47 possesses verified knowledge regarding events and transactions conducted by certain parties between the years 1846 and 1853. A ripple went through the room. Rowan continued, "This knowledge has been independently confirmed by demonstration before 3 witnesses whose identities remain sealed for their protection. The purchaser will receive, along with the bill of sale, detailed instructions regarding the conditions under which this knowledge may be disclosed. The seller guarantees the accuracy and completeness of all information and further certifies that this knowledge cannot be extracted through coercion, as the property has been conditioned to remain silent under force." Rowan paused, swallowing hard. His face had lost all color. The seller concludes with this final statement. "Any party with interest in the occurrences at Magnolia Estate on June 19, 1849, or concern over whereabouts of documents believed destroyed in the warehouse fire of April 1851, or with involvement in the maritime incident of September 1848, will understand the value of acquiring this lot. The seller accepts no responsibility for any consequences should this knowledge become public." The reaction was immediate and visceral. Several men rose at once, faces flushed, breathing shallow. Others leaned back in their chairs with carefully neutral expressions, their eyes darting with frantic calculation. 3 men quietly left the room without a word, moving quickly toward the exit as though proximity to the woman might implicate them. But notably, no one demanded the auction stop. No one declared the sale fraudulent. No one dismissed the affair as nonsense, because everyone present understood the implications. The woman standing silently before them held knowledge, specific knowledge, of events, crimes, and secrets that Charleston's powerful families had spent years, perhaps decades, suppressing. Someone had brought her here not for labor, not for service, but to sell that knowledge to the highest bidder. Rowan's voice cracked as he spoke again. "The opening bid is $10,000. Do I hear 10,000? For a long moment, the room remained frozen. Then, from the back corner, a hand lifted, slow, deliberate. Its owner was a middle-aged man with wind-burned skin, the look of a modest but seasoned landholder. 10,000, he said steadily. 12,000. The second bid came instantly, sharp and confident, from a younger man whose tailored coat and polished gold watch chain marked him as one of Charleston's rising gentry. What happened next would be whispered about for decades, never openly, never where servants or outsiders might hear. The bidding surged with speed and ferocity that defied reason. 15,000. 18. 22. Men who had arrived intending to purchase field workers now found themselves competing for something infinitely more valuable and infinitely more dangerous than labor. They were bidding for protection, protection from reputational ruin, from financial devastation, from criminal exposure. They were bidding for the power to control information that could dismantle entire families. Throughout it all, the woman on the platform remained perfectly still and perfectly silent. Her face held the same composed, almost serene expression even as the numerical value assigned to her body climbed higher and higher. But her eyes never stopped moving. They swept the room with unbroken precision, and more than one bidder later confessed that when her gaze landed on him, He felt as though she were assessing exactly how much he could sacrifice, exactly how desperate he was, exactly how catastrophic the consequences would be if he lost. At $30,000, only 5 bidders remained. At $35,000 and change, the competition had narrowed to men whose resources dwarfed those of ordinary plantation owners. These were bankers, shipping magnates, men whose influence shaped not just their own wealth but the fortunes of entire industries. $38,000, announced a man seated near the front, his tone steady despite the unimaginable sum he had just declared. His name was Cornelius Ashford, and he controlled 2 of Charleston's most powerful banks. $40,000. The reply drifted from a figure sitting deep in the rear shadows, a man whose features remained frustratingly indistinct despite the proximity of others nearby. A collective gasp swept the room. $40,000 exceeded the value of many fully operational plantations, land, buildings, enslaved workers, and equipment included. It was a sum that only the wealthiest men in the South could conceivably assemble. Cornelius Ashford sat rigid, his expression contorted by a mixture of fury and something unmistakably like fear. He twisted in his chair, attempting to make out the identity of the bidder, now rivaling him. After several tense seconds, Ashford exhaled sharply, rose with slow dignity, and walked toward the door. His hands trembled, visible even from across the room. The shadowed bidder stepped forward into the light at last. He stood tall, perhaps in his mid-40s, his face composed and unreadable. His clothing was elegant but restrained. A black coat, a dark vest, no ostentatious jewelry, nothing that would draw unnecessary attention. Those who recognized him knew him only by the name he had given, Mr. Whitlock, a name absent from Charleston social registers, absent from business rosters, absent from church pews. He had arrived 6 weeks earlier, taken rooms at the Planters Hotel, and conducted a series of private dealings with numerous respected men, none of which produced any public record. $42,000, Whitlock said calmly, as if making a casual purchase of tobacco rather than placing the highest recorded bid for a human being in Charleston's history. No one else spoke. The silence stretched so long that several men later claimed they counted their own heartbeats. Marcus Rowan scanned the room one final time, searching for any challenger bold or foolish enough to continue. None appeared. Sold, Rowan whispered finally. Lot 47 to the gentleman for $42,000. The transaction that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Whitlock produced a letter of credit from a Boston institution, which required verification by telegram. A clerk sprinted to the telegraph office on Broad Street, while everyone else waited in suffocating tension. Legal documents had to be drafted from scratch, witnessed by 2 impartial businessmen summoned at once, and stamped with official seals. And then came the matter of payment. Whitlock had arranged for a shipment of gold coin, locked in chests that needed for men to carry, to be delivered from his appointed bank. Through every step, the woman remained on platform, silent and utterly composed, her eyes still cataloging everything with disquieting precision. When the final signature was inked and the last coin counted, Whitlock approached her. For the first time since entering the room, he stood directly before her. He withdrew a key and released the silk rope from her wrists. Unlike iron shackles, the rope left her skin unblemished. He then offered her a shawl. She draped it across her shoulders with quiet, practiced grace. And then Whitlock did something that caused the remaining witnesses to inhale sharply. He offered her his arm, exactly as a gentleman would to an equal. She accepted without hesitation, as though she had known this gesture was coming. Together they walked toward the exit, their posture suggesting partnership rather than the legal fiction of ownership. At the threshold, she stopped and turned back to address the room. In a voice clear, poised, and unmistakably educated, a level of learning legally forbidden to enslaved people, she spoke the only words she would utter during the entire ordeal. Some of you will sleep better now. Some of you will sleep far worse. And some of you will soon learn that knowledge, once created, cannot be destroyed. It only waits until the right moment, to rise again from the dark. Then she turned and stepped into the Charleston sunlight beside Whitlock. And from that moment forward, she vanished from every public record as if she had never existed at all. The departure of Whitlock and the extraordinary woman triggered chaos among Charleston's ruling circles. By midday, whispers raced through the merchant district like fire leaping across dry pine. By nightfall, 3 secret meetings were underway, gatherings of men who never convened publicly but who collectively commanded nearly half of Charleston's commercial power. They met behind locked doors, with trusted servants guarding the halls, while they whispered in frantic, hurried tones about a woman whose knowledge threatened to unravel the carefully buried lies protecting them. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who had sold her? How had she acquired the knowledge she claimed to possess? What did she know about the Magnolia Estate incident, the warehouse fire, the maritime disaster? And most pressing of all, who was Whitlock, and what did he intend to do with the information he had purchased for $42,000? Marcus Rowan provided no guidance. 2 days after the auction, he shuttered his business permanently, claiming sudden illness. He accepted the first cash offer on his building, a price far below its worth, packed his belongings, and boarded a ship bound for New Orleans. Before departing, he burned every record of transactions conducted over the previous 8 years, feeding them into a courtyard fire so large that the fire brigade had to intervene to prevent the flames from spreading. When authorities questioned him about destroying business records that were legally required to be preserved, Rowe replied only that some transactions were better forgotten by everyone involved. The Charleston Mercury never printed a follow-up to its cryptic 7-word notice of the auction. Its former editor, the same man who had resigned a week after publishing that brief line, relocated to Atlanta, where he spent the rest of his career drifting through minor newspaper positions. He died in 1863 without ever writing another word about Charleston society or commerce. But while official Charleston remained silent, private Charleston seethed with speculation and fear. The coffee houses along Broad Street, where merchants typically gathered to discuss cotton prices and shipping schedules, became hubs of tense, whispered conversations. Men who had been close associates for decades now avoided one another, unsure who might be entangled in whatever hidden scandals the mysterious woman knew. Social invitations were quietly declined. Business partnerships dissolved with no explanation. Several prominent families abruptly announced winter trips to Europe, an unusual choice during harvest season, when plantation owners were expected to remain in South Carolina. The first serious attempt to uncover the woman's identity began 3 weeks after the sale. It was initiated by attorney Harrison Calhoun, a specialist in property law who built his reputation by protecting the interests of Charleston's wealthiest families. Calhoun was known for discretion, thoroughness, and an ability to navigate legal gray zones when clients requested it. On November 1st, 1854, he was approached by a group of 7 clients who refused to reveal their names publicly but supplied substantial funds for an investigation into everything concerning Lot 47. Calhoun's first step was a notarized statement Rowan had read aloud during the auction. He went to the courthouse to examine the original document, supposedly witnessed by a Charleston magistrate on October 6. But the clerk told him no such document existed in the public archive. When Calhoun pressed the issue, pointing out that Rowan had clearly read from authenticated papers, the clerk grew defensive and suggested the document might have been misfiled or withdrawn for judicial review. Calhoun then requested to speak with a magistrate whose seal had allegedly appeared on the papers. Charleston employed 3 magistrates authorized to notarize such documents. All 3 denied any involvement and claimed they had never heard of the transaction. This was impossible. Notarized documents required official seals, witnesses, and detailed entries in record books designed to prevent forgery. Yet papers bearing what seemed to be legitimate authentication had surfaced for the auction and then vanished without a trace. Calhoun next attempted to identify the seller. South Carolina law required anyone consigning property for auction to present proof of ownership and transfer documentation. Those papers should have been in Rowan's business files and, when his establishment closed, transferred to the courthouse. But Rowan's massive bonfire had consumed everything. Interviews with Rowan's former clerks revealed that the two men who escorted the woman to the auction had arrived 6 days before the sale, carrying documents that Rowan inspected in private. The clerks remembered Rowan emerging from that meeting visibly shaken. He had poured himself a heavy whiskey despite the early hour and immediately dispatched a messenger to his attorney. That attorney, Silas Peton, refused to discuss the matter with Calhoun or anyone else, citing client confidentiality. When Calhoun suggested that Rowan's sudden departure and destruction of records warranted investigation, Peton coolly replied that his client had violated no laws, that all transactions were conducted properly, and that if certain individuals found the auction's outcome uncomfortable, perhaps they should examine their own conduct before questioning legitimate business practices. The investigation reached its first meaningful breakthrough in late November, when Calhoun tracked down one of the two escorts, Thomas Burke, a private courier known for handling delicate and high-risk assignments. For a significant fee, Burke agreed to meet in a dockside tavern far from Charleston's refined business district, where neither man risked being recognized. Burke spoke with caution, selecting his words deliberately, but what he shared illuminated the mystery in startling ways. He had been hired in August by an intermediary acting on behalf of an unidentified employer. The payment offer was extraordinarily high for a single assignment. Burke and his partner, a fellow courier named James Ridley, were instructed to travel to a remote location in the South Carolina Low Country, retrieve a package, and deliver it safely to Marcus Rowan in Charleston. No questions asked. The destination was an abandoned plantation house, uninhabited for years except for a caretaker who visited occasionally to prevent total ruin. When Burke and Ridley arrived, they found the woman waiting for them. She stood on the front porch, wearing the same dark blue cotton dress she would later wear at the auction. Her belongings were contained in a single neat leather bag. She handed Burke a sealed letter addressed to Rowan and calmly informed him that she was the package they had been hired to transport. Burke admitted he was deeply unsettled. He asked who she was, where she had come from, and why she needed to be delivered under such secrecy. She answered with a poised attachment that Burke would later describe as unnerving. "I am merchandise of exceptional value," she told him. "You have been paid to deliver me unharmed. Beyond that, you need know nothing, except that your employer will guarantee you face no legal consequences for this transport." Burke and Ridley completed the journey without incident, delivered her to Rowan's office, and later received their payment through an anonymous dead-drop arrangement that prevented any possibility of identifying their employer. Burke never saw the woman again after leaving Rowan's auction house and insisted he had no knowledge of her fate once Whitlock took possession. But Burke did share one final detail, one that Calhoun found especially significant. During the 3-day journey from the abandoned plantation to Charleston, the woman spoke very little. But on their last evening, as they camped beside the road, she looked at Burke with an expression he described as almost pitying. "You are wondering who I am and..." "What I know," she said. "So I will tell you this much. I am someone who listened when powerful men believed no one was listening. I am someone who remembered when powerful men assumed their secrets would vanish with time. And I am someone who learned that knowledge becomes valuable only when those in power fears unveiling. You will not be harmed for your part in this, Mr. B, but others will lose everything they have built upon foundations of lies. Remember my words when you hear their names in the coming months." Calhoun relayed Burke's testimony to his anonymous clients, and their response was immediate. They instructed him to intensify the investigation, to uncover the woman's identity, locate Whitlock, and determine exactly what sort of information had been purchased for $42,000. They offered additional funding and made it clear that no cost, no avenue, no risk was to be spared. But the expanded inquiry yielded far more frustration than clarity. Whitlock had departed Charleston the same day as the auction, heading north by private carriage. Messages sent to Boston, where his letter of credit had originated, revealed that the bank managing his account was a discreet private institution catering to wealthy clients who prized confidentiality. The officers confirmed only that Whitlock's credit had been genuine and the funds more than sufficient. No further information could be released. The abandoned plantation where Burke had retrieved the woman proved equally baffling. Property records indicated it belonged to a family named Aswell, prosperous rice planters who had deserted the estate in 1850 after the patriarch died, without direct heirs. Ongoing legal disputes among distant relatives left the estate tied up in court, unoccupied and unmanaged. No one could explain who placed the woman there, or who arranged the timing so precisely that Burke would arrive to find her waiting. Calhoun interviewed the caretaker who periodically visited the Aswell property, an elderly freedman named Isaiah, who had served the family for decades. Isaiah admitted to seeing the woman approximately 6 weeks before Burke's arrival. She had appeared without warning, walking up the long drive as though she belonged there. When Isaiah confronted her, explaining the property was empty and off-limits, she smiled gently and told him she was waiting for someone and would cause no disturbance. Troubled but unsure of his authority to force her away, Isaiah allowed her to stay. She took a room in the upstairs hallway, kept herself immaculately clean, and lived off the supplies he brought during his visits. Most days, he found her seated on the front porch, reading from a thick leather-bound book she carried everywhere. Isaiah never learned what the book contained. He noted only that she turned each page slowly, like someone absorbing every word, committing all to memory. She had an educated air, Isaiah told Calhoun, spoke clearer English than most white folks I've met, and she had this way of looking at you, like she could see right through whatever face you were putting on and into who you truly were underneath. Made me uneasy, but she never caused trouble, never asked for more than the basics. Just sat there reading her book, waiting. When Burke arrived to collect her, she handed Isaiah the book and instructed him to burn it after she left. Isaiah confessed he disobeyed her. Curiosity got the better of him. Instead of burning it, he hid it under a loose floorboard in what used to be the library. Later, when he tried to read it, he discovered the text was written in symbols unlike any alphabet he had ever seen. Strange characters, structured like a language yet wholly unfamiliar. Calhoun persuaded Isaiah to show him the book. Together, they journeyed back to the deserted Aswell estate. Isaiah led him to the hidden compartment beneath the floorboard. Wrapped in oilcloth lay the book, protected from moisture, preserved with care. Calhoun opened it with a mixture of awe and dread. The volume was roughly 300 pages, hand-bound, its cover bearing no title or author. Inside, page after page contained dense writing in what appeared to be a cipher, symbols arranged in consistent patterns that suggested grammar and structure, yet offered no immediate meaning. Interspersed throughout the coded passages were numbers, dates, geographical references, and, occasionally, English words or phrases that appeared abruptly and without explanation. Calhoun recognized several names. Families of high-standing, prominent plantations, ships tied to Charleston's maritime trade, but their presence inside the coded text revealed nothing about their context. On the final page, however, written plainly in English, was a single sentence that made Calhoun's blood freeze. This record contains testimony of events witnessed between 1846 and 1853, preserved in cipher to protect the witness until such time as revelation becomes profitable or necessary. The key to this cipher has been transferred to the party who purchased knowledge with gold. All others will find nothing here but mysteries without solution. Calhoun understood instantly what he was holding. This was the source, the raw account from which the woman's dangerous knowledge originated. She had watched, listened, witnessed events and dealings that Charleston's elite had spent years burying. She had recorded everything in code, safeguarded herself, and then sold the key to that code to Whitlock for $42,000. The book in Calhoun's hands was now worthless without the cipher key, but represented a fortune in locked secrets that would remain sealed unless Whitlock chose to reveal them. The implications were staggering. This woman had not merely stumbled across forbidden information. She had systematically documented it, preserved it, and waited patiently for a precise moment when its value would peak. This required intelligence, foresight, astonishing discipline, and the will to endure years of enslavement while holding knowledge that could fracture the very foundations of Charleston's aristocracy. Who possessed such a mind? What kind of person could carry such purpose for so long? Calhoun reported his findings to his clients, and their reaction confirmed everything he had begun to suspect about the gravity of the situation. They demanded he surrender the cipher book immediately, which he did, and informed him that his services were no longer required. They paid him generously for his efforts, added a substantial bonus for his silence, and made it unmistakably clear that he was to end all inquiries and never speak of the matter again. Harrison Calhoun accepted their terms, but before relinquishing the book, he copied several of its pages, including the final English sentence, believing those copies might one day prove valuable if circumstances changed. He locked them in his office safe, where they would remain undisturbed for nearly 40 years before anyone rediscovered them. Meanwhile, throughout December 1854 and well into January the following year, Charleston's elite lived in a state that could only be described as quiet panic. Men who had built fortunes on cotton, rice, and enslaved labor now found themselves glancing over their shoulders, wondering which secrets might surface, which past sins might be dragged into daylight. Several prominent figures abruptly announced their retirement, selling businesses and properties at shockingly low prices, seemingly desperate to liquidate assets and escape South Carolina. Others descended into paranoia, suspecting surveillance, hiring private guards, conducting routine affairs with a level of secrecy that bordered on theatrical. Then the revelations began. The first came in February 1855, when a major Charleston shipping company collapsed after its primary investor withdrew funding without explanation. At first, the bankruptcy appeared mundane, but investigators reviewing the firm's records for creditors uncovered systematic fraud dating back to 1848. The company had been reporting inflated cargo loads to investors while transporting significantly less, pocketing the difference through falsified bills of lading and bribed customs officials. The maritime incident of September 1848, referenced during the auction, appeared to involve a supposedly lost shipment that had in fact been sold illegally, while company officers claimed insurance payments for cargo that had never been lost at sea. The scandal obliterated 3 wealthy families and resulted in criminal charges against 7 men. One of the accused took his own life, leaving behind a note containing only a haunting line. She knew she was there. We thought her invisible, and believing that has destroyed us. The second revelation struck in April, when a warehouse fire revealed traces of an earlier fire, one deliberately set in April 1851 to destroy account books documenting illegal slave importation. By law, importing enslaved Africans into the United States after 1808 was a federal crime. But enormous fortunes could be made by smuggling captured Africans into Charleston and selling them to buyers willing to ignore or conceal their origin. A conspiracy involving customs officials, ship captains, and wealthy planters had operated for years, using the warehouse as temporary housing for smuggled captives. When investigators grew suspicious in 1851, the conspirators burned the warehouse to destroy evidence. Now, for years later, someone had supplied federal authorities with detailed documentation, names, dates, ships, payments. The source was never disclosed, but rumors spread that an anonymous package had appeared on the federal marshal's desk, its contents so exhaustive and accurate that prosecution became unavoidable. 7 men were charged, and 2 of Charleston's most prestigious families saw their wealth confiscated. The third and most devastating revelation involved the Magnolia Plantation incident of June 19, 1849. This event had been buried so deeply that only a small circle of participants and paid accomplices knew fragments of the truth. But in August 1855, a Boston abolitionist newspaper published a chilling expose describing what had occurred that night. According to the article, a private gathering had been held at Magnolia Plantation, attended by roughly 20 of Charleston's most influential men. to discuss strategies for countering rising northern opposition to slavery. While the gentlemen drank whiskey and debated politics, a crisis unfolded among the enslaved staff serving the event. A young house servant, perhaps 16 years old, overheard conversations revealing criminal acts several attendees were desperate to keep hidden. When her eavesdropping was discovered, the men deemed her an unacceptable risk. What followed was never recorded officially, but witnesses later testified that she was taken from the house under the pretense of punishment, led out into the fields, and vanished. There was no bill of sale, no transfer of ownership, no paperwork of any kind. She had simply ceased to exist. The men responsible possessed enough influence to ensure absolute silence. The Boston article named names. It recounted precise conversations, reported who had made the decision and who had carried it out. The information was too detailed, too accurate, too intimate to have come from anyone except an eyewitness who remembered everything. The article ended with a paragraph that sent shockwaves through Charleston. The source of this information is a woman who served alongside the murdered girl that night, who heard everything, witnessed everything, and remembered everything. For years, she remained silent, knowing that speaking would mean death. But silence becomes valuable only when those with the most to lose fear exposure more than they value secrecy. This woman has now sold her testimony to parties who will ensure it reaches those capable of demanding justice. Charleston's gentlemen may have believed their slaves blind and deaf to their crimes. They have learned too late that invisibility is not the same as absence. If you're disturbed by the way these powerful men treated human beings as disposable, then you're exactly the kind of person who needs to hear these stories. Hit that like button and leave a comment about what you believe should happen to those who commit such crimes. And don't forget to share this video, because history this dark must be brought into the light. Now, let's continue uncovering who this woman truly was and how she survived long enough to make Charleston's elite pay for their sins. The Boston article ignited fury throughout Charleston. Several prominent men demanded investigations into whoever had supplied the information, threatening lawsuits against the paper for libel and defamation. But the article had been crafted with meticulous care. It presented itself as testimony from an anonymous witness rather than issuing direct accusations. And crucially, the Boston editors refused to identify their source or even confirm the person's existence, citing the need to protect witnesses from retaliation. No criminal charges followed. Too much time had passed. Too many involved had died, disappeared, or relocated, and the legal system remained under control of the very class implicated in the scandal. But the social consequences reverberated sharply. Certain families found themselves quietly shunned by those who feared proximity to scandal. Business relationships dissolved overnight. A cotton factor named Edmund Grayson, identified in the article as one of the men who decided the young witness at Magnolia Plantation should vanish, soon discovered that banks would no longer extend him credit. Within a year, he had lost his firm, his Charleston townhouse, and was forced to retreat to a remote low-country property, where he lived in deepening isolation until his death in 1859. Throughout all these revelations, one question persisted in private conversations among Charleston's increasingly anxious elite. Where was Whitlock? What was he doing with the information he had purchased? And who was the woman he had taken north? The answers would not begin to surface for nearly 30 years. And when they finally did, the truth proved far more extraordinary than anyone imagined. The mystery of Whitlock and the woman he protected continued to haunt Harrison Calhoun. Long after his official involvement had ended, he had been paid generously to stop investigating, and his anonymous clients had made it abundantly clear that further inquiries would be dangerous. Yet Calhoun could not let the matter rest. He had glimpsed something in that ciphered book, something in the meticulous orchestration of events, something in the precise way Charleston's most powerful men were being dismantled piece by piece. This was not random vengeance. This was not blackmail for profit. This was justice, calculated and executed with the patience of someone who had waited years, perhaps a decade, for the perfect moment. Then, in September 1855, Calhoun received an envelope delivered to his office by a messenger who knew nothing about its sender. Inside was a single newspaper clipping from a Philadelphia publication dated 3 weeks earlier. The article was small, tucked between advertisements for tonics and notices about public lectures. It announced the founding of a private academy for freed men and women in Philadelphia, funded entirely by an anonymous benefactor. The school would offer instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, and practical trades to formerly enslaved people seeking to rebuild their lives in the North. The funding appeared substantial, suggesting the benefactor possessed considerable resources and a deep commitment to the education of Black Americans. The clipping contained no personal message, no explanation for why it had been sent to Calhoun specifically, but he understood instantly. This was where the $42,000 had gone, or at least part of it. Whitlock had not purchased a woman's knowledge for personal gain or for blackmail. He had purchased it to free her, to avenge her, and to empower her. And now that her revenge was well underway, the wealth was being redirected towards something life-changing. Calhoun placed the clipping in his desk drawer and told no one, but he began reading northern newspapers obsessively, hunting for patterns. Any sign of her continued influence. He found them, but assembling the pattern required months of scrutiny. In November 1855, a prominent Boston law firm specializing in abolitionist cases received an anonymous donation of $15,000, enabling them to expand their defense of fugitive slaves and intensify legal challenges to machinery of bondage. In January 1856, a freedmen's community in upstate New York received a grant to purchase farmland, allowing once enslaved families to establish independent agricultural settlements. In March, a Philadelphia publishing house received funds to print and distribute first-hand slave narratives, accounts seldom seen by northern readers. Each donation came through different channels, carried by intermediaries, impossible to trace back to a single source. But Calhoun recognized a pattern. Someone with significant resources, unwavering purpose, and intimate knowledge of slavery's machinery was quietly building the infrastructure of abolition, helping enslaved people escape, strengthening legal resistance, fueling political challenges, constructing a future in which her own suffering would never be repeated. And still, new revelations continued to surface in Charleston. In April 1856, federal authorities received detailed documentation of a banking fraud scheme operating between 1849 and 1853, one that manipulated cotton prices through coordinated false reporting. 3 merchants faced federal charges. 1 committed suicide before trial. In July, customs officials uncovered years of systematic bribery, resulting in the dismissal of 7 officials and criminal charges against 2 supervisors. Each revelation arrived packaged with anonymous documentation, so specific, so accurate, so clearly the work of someone who had been physically present while powerful men spoke freely, assuming enslaved servants were incapable of understanding complicated financial schemes. Someone who had absorbed everything, recorded everything, and waited years for the moment when that knowledge could be turned into a weapon. Charleston's elite began to understand what they were facing. This was not a single act of blackmail, not a disgruntled servant seeking revenge. This was systematic demolition, a campaign designed to expose every crime, conspiracy, and buried atrocity the city's ruling families had amassed over decades. And there was no way to negotiate, no way to buy silence. The information had already been sold, and the money was being used to fund the destruction of slavery itself, the very system that had enabled those crimes. The psychological impact on Charleston society was immense. Even men who had done nothing more than participate in the ordinary cruelties of slavery found themselves growing paranoid. They wondered whether their own servants were listening, remembering, waiting. Trust evaporated. Long-time partnerships collapsed under suspicion. Household servants, long treated as afterthoughts, were suddenly regarded with tense caution. Conversations were hushed. Documents were locked away. Some families even began sending trusted slaves away, believing distance could somehow protect them. Amid the slow-motion collapse of Charleston's social order, a handful of individuals began asking different questions. Not who the woman was, or where she had gone, but how she had accomplished the impossible. How does an enslaved woman learn to read in a society that criminalizes her education? How does she access the private business dealings of Charleston's richest men? How does she record and encode information while remaining invisible to those she studied? And perhaps most astonishing, how does she endure years of bondage while holding knowledge that would free her instantly, waiting for the perfect moment to extract maximum value? The first partial answer came in 1873, nearly 20 years after the auction. Robert Ashford, a former Confederate officer, published a memoir of his wartime experiences. Buried among accounts of battles and marches was a curious anecdote, a conversation he overheard in Charleston in 1856. According to Ashford, he had attended a dinner party where several older gentlemen discussed the now infamous auction. One man, identified only as a prominent rice planter, spoke with cold, bitter admiration for the woman who had brought ruin upon them. "We created her," the planter said, as Ashford remembered. "We brought that particular doom upon ourselves through arrogance and blindness. You want to know how a slave learned to read? We taught her. You want to know how she gained access to our dealings? We brought her into our offices and parlors, believing her presence no more significant than a chair or a rug. We spoke freely in front of her because we were certain she lacked the capacity to understand us. And when she showed intelligence that unsettled us, we insisted we were imagining things. Acknowledging her mind meant acknowledging our sin. That was intolerable." The planter's voice reportedly softened. "I knew her before the auction. She served in my household for 3 years. I watched her learn to read, studying books when she thought no one observed. I watched her replay conversations silently, word for word. I watched her grasp complicated financial matters better than some men I've known. And I did nothing. We all did nothing. Because accepting her brilliance would have required accepting that we held in bondage someone whose mind surpassed our own. So we closed our eyes, and in that blindness, we created a threat so profound that her knowledge alone was worth more than most plantations." Ashford's memoir drew little attention when it appeared. The Civil War had ended 8 years earlier, and few cared about pre-war Charleston scandals. But that passage would later become a crucial piece of the puzzle. The second major breakthrough arrived in 1881, when a Philadelphia teacher named Catherine Winters published a collection of oral histories from formerly enslaved people living in northern communities. Among these interviews was one from an elderly woman identified only as Harriet, who had escaped Charleston in 1857. Harriet described someone she had known briefly, a woman she called the most dangerous person I ever met. Though to her owner, she appeared perfectly docile, even forgettable. According to Harriet, this woman had passed quietly through multiple Charleston households over more than a decade, sold and resold not because she caused problems, but because she made her owners vaguely uneasy. She worked as a house servant, unobtrusive and efficient. She never caused trouble, never sought attention, but she possessed something that frightened those who looked too long into her eyes, a sharp, relentless intelligence she had learned to conceal. She would stand in a corner while gentlemen conducted business, Harriet said, and they would forget she was there. They'd discuss money, land, schemes they shouldn't share. She looked still as stone, like she wasn't even listening, but she heard everything, and she remembered everything. Harriet recounted that the woman could repeat entire conversations, word for word, months later, mimicking the tone, cadence, even gestures of the men speaking. Harriet saw her do it once. "It scared me so bad," she said. "I never asked her again." Then Harriet shared the detail that would eventually explain everything. She told me once that invisibility was the greatest weapon an enslaved person could have. If they saw you as human, they watched you with suspicion. If they saw you as property, as furniture with breath, they let their guard down completely. She said she learned to make herself invisible by appearing exactly as they expected, nothing more and nothing less. And in that invisibility, She could see everything they tried to hide. Catherine Winters's book drew modest interest in abolitionist circles, but made little impression on the broader public. Its oral histories were considered valuable, but overshadowed by the more widely known narratives of figures like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. Only decades later would researchers recognize Harriet's testimony as one of the few first-hand descriptions of the woman's methodology, her strategy, her mindset, and her discipline. The most detailed information about what happened after Whitlock purchased a woman would not surface until 1903, nearly 50 years after the auction. That year, an attorney in Boston died, leaving among his personal effects a sealed letter labeled with strict instructions. It was to be opened only after his death and shared with historians studying antebellum Charleston. The attorney's name was Jonathan Whitlock, son of the man who had purchased Lot 47 in 1854. The younger Whitlock had inherited his father's papers, and inside the sealed envelope was a lengthy account written by his father before his death in 1879. According to this document, Jonathan Whitlock, Sr. had been approached in July 1854 by an intermediary acting on behalf of an unnamed party, someone who possessed information of immense value to numerous Charleston families. This intermediary explained that the information was controlled by an enslaved woman who possessed documented evidence of crimes committed between 1846 and 1853. The woman intended to sell her knowledge, but only under specific conditions. She insisted she be purchased by someone with no ties to Charleston, someone immune to pressure from the powerful families whose secrets she held. She required a guarantee that the proceeds from the sale would be used for abolitionist causes and to establish her own freedom in the North. She demanded that the revelations be released strategically, in a manner that maximized harm to the guilty while minimizing chaos that might endanger other enslaved people. Whitlock, a committed abolitionist who had earned his fortune in northern shipping, agreed. He traveled to Charleston, reviewed the ciphered documentation the woman had created, confirmed its accuracy through discreet consultations, and determined that the information was indeed valuable enough to justify paying a staggering sum. He arrived at Ryan's auction house prepared to bid up to $50,000 if necessary, so winning the woman for $42,000 was, in his view, a fortunate outcome. After the auction, Whitlock transported her to Pennsylvania, where he began the legal process of formalizing her freedom. South Carolina's laws made manumission difficult, but Whitlock's attorney succeeded. By January 1855, the woman was legally free, though she chose to keep her enslaved name, a deliberate reminder of what she had endured. Over the next 3 years, she and Whitlock worked together to release her information in carefully curated stages. She selected targets with precision, ensured her timing inflicted maximum damage, and pursued justice not only for herself but for the countless others harmed by Charleston's elite. Her strategic mind impressed even Whitlock. She understood not just what to reveal, but when and how to reveal in ways that rippled through legal, financial, and political systems. Whitlock's letter included another remarkable detail: her emotional state. He described her as unnervingly calm. She expressed no visible fury toward the men who had enslaved her, nor satisfaction when they fell. She conducted herself like someone performing essential, unpleasant work. Whitlock recorded one conversation that researchers would later underline as crucial. "I asked her once if she felt joy seeing these men ruined," he wrote. She thought for a long time before answering. "Joy requires freedom I do not yet possess," she said. "I am free by law, but not free in my own mind. That will come only when I have rebuilt myself into something beyond reaction to what was done to me. Until then, this work is necessary, like removing infection from a wound. One does not celebrate the removal. One simply removes it and moves forward." Whitlock's letter concluded with answers historians have pursued for decades: the woman's name, her origins, and her life after her vengeance. Her name was Eliza Rothman. She had been born in Charleston in 1824, the daughter of an enslaved woman and a Jewish merchant who refused to acknowledge her publicly. Her mother had been unusually educated, taught to read and write by a former owner who defied the law by educating household servants. She passed this knowledge to Eliza in secret, using stolen books and whispered lessons late at night. Eliza's mother died of fever when Eliza was 14, and the girl was sold to settle estate debts. Over the next 16 years, Eliza passed to the hands of 7 Charleston families. Each time, she was sold not because she misbehaved, but because something about her unsettled her owners, an intelligence they sensed but could not accept. Working as a house servant, she gained access to private dealings among Charleston's wealthiest men. She served in offices during confidential negotiations. She stood in parlors during secret meetings. She listened as crimes were planned, justified, and forgotten, and she remembered everything. Her eidetic memory allowed her to retain conversations, names, dates, and interlocking details with flawless precision. In 1846, she began recording what she witnessed using a cipher she invented herself, drawing from Hebrew her father taught her in rare moment of recognition, and a numerical system inspired by patterns she had observed in shipping manifests and account books. She wrote in stolen notebooks, hiding her documentation in various hiding places throughout Charleston, creating redundant copies to prevent discovery. By 1853, she possessed enough information to destroy dozens of powerful men, but she waited, knowing that timing was everything. Revealing her knowledge while still enslaved would mean certain death. She needed to convert information into freedom first, and that required finding a buyer willing to purchase not just her body, but the secret she carried, under conditions that guaranteed her survival. The auction of 1854 was a culmination of nearly 2 years of meticulous planning, negotiating through intermediaries, setting conditions, arranging her own sale in a way that would maximize both the price and her safety. After securing her freedom and completing her campaign of revelations, Eliza left Pennsylvania and relocated to Ohio, where she founded a school for freed men and women. She taught reading, writing, and practical skills, funded by the remaining portion of the $42,000. The school operated quietly, without seeking recognition, serving around 30 students each year. If stories like this fascinate you, stories buried in history, locked away in sealed rooms until someone dares to unearth them, then you're in the right place. That is exactly what the sealed room exists to do: bring forgotten truths into the light. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss these extraordinary stories that history tried so hard to erase. Eliza Rothman lived until 1897, dying at 73 in a modest house beside the school she had built. Her obituary in the local Ohio newspaper made no mention of her early life. It described her simply as an educator devoted to uplifting formerly enslaved people. No one at her funeral knew she had once sold for $42,000. No one knew she had toppled some of Charleston's most powerful families. No one knew she had executed one of the most patient, calculated acts of resistance in American history. But the story did not end with her death. Information, once created, persists. It waits, sometimes quietly, sometimes for generations, until the right moment to emerge again. The decades following Eliza's death brought enormous changes to America. The Civil War had abolished slavery. Reconstruction had attempted and ultimately failed to create true racial equality. A new century dawned with promises of progress that proved both earnest and elusive. Yet in Charleston, among families who survived the war and clung to their inherited wealth, certain stories endured. In hushed tones, past the children and grandchildren, warnings remained about the woman who had ruined their ancestors, who had exposed their crimes, who had reminded them, and history, that secrets are never buried forever. The coded book Eliza created, the one Harrison Calhoun discovered in the abandoned Aswell plantation, passed through several hands after Calhoun's anonymous clients seized it. For years they tried to decipher it, hiring linguists and cryptographers, offering rewards to anyone who could unlock its contents. Every attempt failed. Without the cipher key Eliza had sold to Whitlock, the book remained impenetrable, a cruel artifact of knowledge in plain sight, but forever unreadable. In 1872, the book vanished from the private collection where it was stored. No record explained how or by whom it was taken. But 15 years later, in 1887, portions of its contents began surfacing, quietly, subtly, in scholarly articles focused on antebellum Charleston economics. These academic papers documented business practices, financial schemes, and social arrangements of Charleston's pre-war elite. The tone was clinical and academic. The citations appeared conventional. But those who knew Charleston's buried scandals immediately recognized the details. These were the same crimes Eliza had exposed decades earlier. Someone had deciphered the book. Someone had access to her full documentation. Someone was releasing it gradually through legitimate scholarship, transforming her revenge into historical fact, ensuring that her testimony would not vanish as scandal but endure as documented truth for generations. The identity of this person remained unknown until 1923, when a Howard University professor named Marcus Whitlock, grandson of the man who purchased Eliza in 1854, published a sweeping history of Charleston's antebellum economy. The book, Foundations of Prosperity, The Hidden Architecture of Southern Wealth, drew heavily on primary sources Marcus claimed were provided to him by his grandfather before the elder Whitlock's death. In the introduction, Marcus revealed what previous generations had kept secret. His grandfather had not merely purchased Eliza's knowledge, he had earned her trust, and in return, she had given him the cipher key to decode her book, along with detailed verbal explanations, context, motivations, connections that no written record alone could convey. Over the 3 years she worked with the elder Whitlock, she had essentially delivered a complete oral history of Charleston's hidden economy. Whitlock documented everything, preserving it carefully. When Eliza left Pennsylvania for Ohio, she granted Whitlock permission to use the information as he saw fit, but asked that it be released only after her death. She did not want her later life as an educator overshadowed by her earlier life as a witness and avenger. Whitlock honored her request. He kept the documentation sealed until Eliza's death in 1897, then released portions gradually through academic channels that would treat the material with the seriousness it deserved. Marcus Whitlock's book became a respected academic text, though it provoked controversy in Charleston, where few families still possess enough influence to protest the publication of their ancestors' crimes. But by 1923, their objections carried little weight. The book entered university history curricula across the country and established Marcus Whitlock as a leading scholar of Southern economic history. But Marcus's book contained something even more valuable than economic insight. It offered details about Eliza herself, details that filled long-standing gaps in the historical record. He revealed that Eliza had not worked alone. She had been part of a network of enslaved people in Charleston who shared information, warned each other about dangerous owners, and maintained an informal intelligence system operating entirely beneath the awareness of white society. This network had existed for decades, possibly longer, composed primarily of household servants who moved quietly through the private spaces of powerful families. They overheard confidential conversations. They handled personal letters and business documents. They saw everything. Most could not read or write, so they relied on oral transmission. Information traveled through trusted channels, building a collective understanding of which owners posed the greatest danger, which households were safe, and what secrets the elite wanted buried. Eliza, with her rare education and extraordinary memory, became the central hub of this network, someone who could record what others could only retain temporarily. The network assisted her in crucial ways. They helped her hide her notes in secure places. They supplied additional details when she needed to fill gaps. And when she began planning her own sale, they coordinated the flow of information to the right intermediaries at the right moments. Marcus Whitlock's revelation challenged long-held assumptions about enslaved people's agency and organization. Historians already knew enslaved communities resisted through slowdown, sabotage, and escape networks. But the idea of a sophisticated intelligence network documenting crimes, sharing information, maintaining institutional memory across years despite illiteracy and surveillance, forced scholars to reconsider how much had been hiding in plain sight. If such a network existed in Charleston, then why not in Richmond, in New Orleans? In every city where enslaved domestic workers had access to the private lives of the wealthy, how much knowledge had vanished when emancipation dissolved these networks? How many other women like Eliza had possessed devastating information but died before they could use it to secure their freedom, or chose to take their secrets to the grave? These questions fueled a new generation of research. Scholars began scouring slave narratives, oral histories, and local records for hints of similar operations, attempting to reconstruct what enslaved people knew about the society that held them captive. A breakthrough arrived in 1936 during the Federal Writers Project, when researchers interviewed an elderly woman in Georgia named Sarah Brooks. Sarah, born in Charleston in 1848 and enslaved there until emancipation, recalled hearing childhood stories about the woman who sold secrets and the network that supported her. According to Sarah, the network continued operating after Eliza's departure, though with less coordination. Its role shifted from documenting crimes to protecting enslaved people, sharing warnings about dangerous owners, brutal overseers, frequent traders, and situations that should be avoided. This protective network persisted into Reconstruction, dissolving only when emancipation rendered its purpose obsolete. Researchers located surviving members or descendants of the network. Their oral histories added essential detail, proving that enslaved people in urban environments created far more sophisticated systems of resistance than previously acknowledged. But perhaps the most extraordinary development in Eliza Rothman's story arrived in 1941, when renovations to a Charleston building uncovered a sealed cache of documents hidden behind a false wall. The building had once housed a bank that failed during the Civil War. The hidden documents appeared to be records someone had concealed to keep Union forces from discovering them. Among the papers was a series of letters exchanged between Charleston merchants in 1855 and 1856, letters discussing the auction scandal and plotting a coordinated response to the revelations that were destroying their businesses and reputations. The letters included something no historian had known before: the identity of the man who originally sold Eliza. His name was Thomas Ashton, younger brother of the plantation owner, whose estate had been abandoned after his death. Thomas inherited several enslaved people from his brother's estate, while the property itself became tied in legal disputes. Among those enslaved people was Eliza, who had served in the Ashton household for 3 years before the elder brother's death. Thomas had sensed something dangerous in her quiet intelligence. He noticed she understood conversations she should not have understood. He suspected she could read, though he never caught her with a book. He feared she might be documenting information about his business dealings, which included several ventures of questionable legality. But instead of confronting her, Thomas chose a different path. He decided to sell her. Yet he also realized that if Eliza possessed incriminating knowledge, a conventional sale would simply transfer the threat to a new owner, someone who might not control her adequately. He believed he needed a solution that would both neutralize the danger she posed and maximize his profit. According to the letters uncovered in 1941, it was Thomas Ashton who conceived the plan that ultimately led to the infamous auction. His idea was straightforward in its cynicism. He would arrange for Eliza to be sold publicly, accompanied by documentation implying she possessed valuable, sensitive knowledge. This would drive the bidding to extraordinary heights while ensuring she ended up in the hands of a buyer wealthy and powerful enough to suppress or exploit whatever information she might hold. Such a buyer, Thomas assumed, would either use her knowledge for blackmail or silence her through threats or incentives. In either case, Thomas would benefit financially while shifting all risk onto someone else. What he failed to anticipate was that Eliza would turn his entire scheme back on him. She recognized his fear, understood his intentions, and used the auction he orchestrated as the perfect vehicle for her own liberation. She crafted the documentation shown to buyers, vague enough to alarm a wide circle of men, but specific enough to provoke serious bidding. Through intermediaries, she ensured Whitlock would be present with adequate funds to outbid Charleston's elite. She coordinated every detail, so the sale would secure her freedom while simultaneously setting the stage for the very men who feared her knowledge to face exposure. The 1941 letters revealed that Thomas Ashton became one of the first casualties of Eliza's campaign. In March 1855, only 5 months after the auction, federal investigators received anonymous documentation outlining years of customs fraud tied directly to Thomas. He was indicted, convicted, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He died in 1858 behind bars, stripped of his fortune, his reputation, and ultimately his life, all because he underestimated the woman he tried to sell. The discovery of these letters sparked renewed scholarly interest in Eliza's story. In 1947, historian Catherine Morgan published what would become the definitive biography, The Witness, Eliza Rothman and the Architecture of Resistance. Morgan's work brought together decades of research, oral histories, archival findings, and careful interpretation to create the most complete portrait yet of Eliza's life, methods, and legacy. Morgan argued that Eliza's significance extended far beyond her individual brilliance or the extraordinary nature of her resistance. She represented a pattern of hidden agency that permeated enslaved communities across the South. Eliza did not possess supernatural abilities. She did not stumble upon unusual opportunities. Rather, she recognized the subtle openings created by the system designed to oppress her and exploited those openings with discipline, intelligence, and breathtaking courage. Morgan emphasized one central insight. Invisibility was both the instrument of oppression and the key to opportunity. Enslavers refused to acknowledge enslaved people as fully human, as possessing inner lives, intelligence, or agency. That blindness made them careless. They spoke freely in front of servants. They left documents in open view. They conducted illicit business in the presence of people they considered no more cognitively present than furniture. Eliza realized that this forced invisibility offered her unprecedented access. She transformed it into observation, documentation, and ultimately weaponized knowledge. Morgan also addressed the moral complexity of Eliza's revenge. Some readers viewed her systematic dismantling of Charleston's elite as righteous justice, long overdue. Others were uneasy, questioning whether revenge served any broader purpose or merely perpetuated cycles of harm. Morgan refused to simplify the issue. She insisted that Eliza must be understood within the constraints of her world. Eliza had no legal recourse, no institutional protection, no avenue for justice. She lived in a society that defined her as property, prohibited her education, and would have killed her for challenging the men who owned her. Within those suffocating limitations, she carved out a path not only to freedom but to accountability. Whether her actions constituted justice, revenge, or simple survival, Morgan argued, depended on a reader's own relationship to power and their understanding of morality in systems designed to deny it. The biography received widespread acclaim and became required reading in university courses on slavery, resistance, and African American history. But it also ignited controversy, especially among descendants of Charleston families ruined by Eliza's revelations. Some accused Morgan of unfairly villainizing their ancestors and oversimplifying the economic pressures of the antebellum South. Morgan responded directly. She argued that difficult circumstances did not excuse participation in systematic oppression, and economic pressure certainly did not justify murder, fraud, or any of the other crimes Eliza had exposed. The debate spilled into academic journals and national publications, forcing Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about historical memory, inherited accountability, and the long shadow cast by slavery. These conversations intensified to the 1950s and 1960s as the civil rights movement pushed the nation to examine ongoing racial inequalities and the historical structures that produced them. Eliza's story became a touchstone, proof that Black resistance had always existed, that intelligence and agency survived even the most repressive systems, and that the struggle for freedom had taken many forms, many of them invisible to historians who relied on written records created by white society. In 1968, a college in Ohio near the site of Eliza's former school renamed one of its academic buildings Rothman Hall in her honor. At the dedication ceremony, civil rights activist James Crawford delivered a speech that would later be widely quoted. Eliza Rothman understood something we must remember today. Crawford said, "Power fears knowledge more than it fears violence. Violence can be crushed by greater violence. But knowledge, once it slips into the world, multiplies, spreads, becomes impossible to contain." Eliza knew that the men who owned her body feared her mind. She knew their crimes would destroy them if exposed. And she understood that patience, documentation, and strategic revelation could accomplish what confrontation never could. We honor her not only for her courage, but for her strategic brilliance, for recognizing that resistance takes many forms. And sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply the truth, preserved and released at the moment that ensures it will do the most good. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Eliza's story received even greater scholarly attention. As historians developed new approaches for studying enslaved people's experiences, they began examining plantation records, correspondence, and legal archives not for insights into enslavers, but for what these documents inadvertently revealed about enslaved lives, relationships, and resistance strategies. This shift in perspective revealed something transformative. Networks like the one Eliza participated in were far more common than previously believed. Organized intelligence gathering, information sharing, and long-term collaborative memory were not rare anomalies. They were widespread practices among enslaved communities, especially in urban environments where servants moved freely through the private spaces of the elite. In 1992, a museum in Charleston opened an exhibition titled Hidden Witnesses: Enslaved People and the Documentary Record. The exhibit explored how enslaved people observed, remembered, and occasionally recorded society that tried to render them invisible. Eliza's story formed the emotional and intellectual center of the exhibition. Display cases included her coded book, excerpts from documents she helped expose, and testimonies from those who knew her or her network. The exhibition provoked intense controversy. Some locals welcomed it as overdue truth-telling. Others saw it as an assault on Charleston's heritage. The museum received threats. Security increased, but attendance remained strong, and the exhibit later traveled to multiple U.S. cities, exposing thousands more to Eliza's extraordinary life. The arrival of digital technology in the 21st century brought new energy to Eliza's legacy. Online archives, digitized manuscripts, and social media allowed researchers and the general public to rediscover hidden histories. Documentarians attempted to dramatize her story, though none completed their projects due to the challenge of visualizing a narrative so dependent on secrecy and coded information. In 2015, playwright Angela Morrison debuted a one-woman show titled The Cipher in Philadelphia. It received powerful reviews for a portrayal of memory, justice, and the lingering consequences of systematic oppression. The production toured nationally for 2 years, bringing Eliza's story to audiences unaccustomed to hearing detailed accounts of enslaved people's intellectual resistance. But the most significant recent development arrived in 2019, when researchers using advanced imaging technology re-examined Eliza's coded book preserved in university archives. These tools revealed erased and overwritten layers of text beneath the visible cipher. To the astonishment of historians, Eliza had not only documented crimes, she had kept a private journal, recording her fears, reflections, and hopes alongside the objective material she intended to weaponize. This hidden memoir was unlike anything scholars had seen. Unlike published slave narratives shaped for Northern readers, Eliza wrote her thoughts while still enslaved, with no expectation anyone would ever read them. The writing was unfiltered, intimate, and hauntingly literary. One passage, dated March 1851, captured the immense psychological weight she carried. "I have carried this knowledge for 5 years now, adding to it almost daily as I witness new crimes, new cruelties, new demonstrations of how power corrupts even men who consider themselves moral. The weight becomes crushing at times. I know things that could destroy families and businesses, send men to prison or to the gallows. And I can do nothing with this knowledge except preserve it and wait. Wait for what? I do not always know. I tell myself I wait for the right opportunity, for circumstances that will allow me to secure my freedom in exchange for what I know. But some nights I wonder if I am simply afraid. Afraid that releasing this information will change nothing, that these men are too powerful for consequences, that my years of observing and remembering will amount to nothing. Or worse, afraid that I will die before I find a way to use what I know, and all this careful work will vanish with me, leaving no trace that I witnessed these things, that I remembered, that I refuse to let their crimes disappear into the silence they rely upon. Another entry, written shortly before she arranged her sale, revealed the clarity of her strategic thinking. I have realized something important. The information I possess has value precisely because these men know they are guilty, know their crimes to destroy them if exposed, and therefore live in perpetual fear of discovery. Their fear makes them vulnerable in ways their power cannot shield. They will pay enormous sums to secure silence or control information they believe threatens them. So I will give them what they fear, but in a way that transforms their fear into my freedom. They will bid against one another, driven by panic and desperation. And in their frantic competition to protect themselves, they will finance my escape from their control. There is a certain poetry in this, using their guilty knowledge, their own hidden crimes, to force them to purchase what they dread most. I will become the most expensive property any of them has ever acquired, not because of my labor or my body, but because of my mind, the very thing they insist does not exist within me. Let them finally acknowledge what they always knew and always denied. Let them pay the price for that acknowledgement. And let that price free me to become more than their property, more than their fear, more than their crimes. The discovery and publication of these passages sparked a new wave of scholarship examining the psychological and philosophical depth of Eliza's resistance. Here was a woman who had not only defied slavery, but who had thought carefully and strategically about the nature of power, fear, and truth. Someone who understood that systems of oppression rest on silence and blindness, and that visibility itself becomes a weapon when wielded by the oppressed. These passages also revealed something earlier histories had only hinted at. Eliza's campaign was not driven solely by anger, though she surely felt it. It was driven by conviction, a belief that crimes hidden through power must eventually be exposed, that oppressive systems depend on secrecy, and that breaking silence represents a form of resistance more devastating than open revolt because it undermines a foundation on which injustice rests. They believe they can do anything as long as no one speaks of it, she wrote. They believe silence equals consent, that invisibility equals non-existence, that power grants immunity from consequence. I will teach them otherwise. I will show them that every word spoken in the presence of the people they believe do not listen has been heard. Every document left accessible to the people they believe cannot read has been read. Every crime committed under cover of darkness, believing no witnesses existed, has been witnessed and remembered. They have built their world on a foundation of convenient blindness. I will strip that blindness away and let them see what they have always refused to acknowledge. The people they own possess minds that observed, understood, and remembered everything. We were never as invisible as they needed us to be. These words, written more than a century and a half ago by a woman who lived entirely within a system designed to crush people like her, resonated powerfully with modern audiences. In an era increasingly aware of systemic injustice, secrecy, and abuses of power, Eliza's reflections felt startlingly contemporary. What should we take from the story of a woman who sold for more than a plantation, who weaponized knowledge against men who insisted she possessed none, who waited years for the perfect moment to turn invisibility into leverage? Perhaps this: resistance takes many forms. Patience can be as revolutionary as rebellion, and memory becomes a weapon when wielded by those whose dignity and truth are the last things they own. Eliza Rothman understood a truth Charleston's elite tried desperately to deny: that every human being possesses a mind capable of observation and understanding, that knowledge cannot be buried forever, and that systems built on injustice eventually collapse, not because they are violently toppled, but because their own crimes, carefully documented and precisely revealed, become the tools of their undoing. She stood on that auction platform in October of 1854, silent, composed, watching as men bid frantically for what she knew. And in that silence, she revealed something profound, that the oppressed are never entirely powerless, that those who demand invisibility invite their own surveillance, that intelligence and patience can accomplish what force never could. Knowledge, once created and preserved, waits in hidden rooms, in sealed places, in forgotten books, for someone brave and patient enough to bring it into the light. Charleston tried to forget her. The family she destroyed tried to bury her story as thoroughly as they buried their crimes. But knowledge persists. Truth waits. And in sealed rooms all across history, there are stories like this one, waiting for someone to unlock the door and let the light in. What do you think Charleston's elite feared most? The exposure of their specific crimes, or the realization that enslaved people had been watching, listening, and remembering everything all along? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think differently about resistance, power, and memory, subscribe to The Sealed Room, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These are the stories history tried to seal away. We're bringing them into the light, one buried truth at a time. See you in the next video, where we'll open another sealed room and discover what has been waiting in the darkness to be.